Hey, welcome back to Electric Cafe. Today is day number 15 in my 30 days of one album per day, focusing on 60s, 70s, 80s, new age, experimental, and ambient records, and reviewing them. Ones that I've found over the years. This one's one of the early ones. This one, Andrew Rudin's, I believe it's Tragedodia. It's from 1968. I found this record probably about 25 years ago, when I was digging around a lot around that time for different kind of space music and trying to understand music that came out before and the lineage of electronic music. As I kind of got into electronic music pretty early, but as it evolved, I realized that it's also really important to know where it came from. And so the learning aspect really grew in my early or mid 20s. I started to really kind of get deeper and more interested in hearing where these sounds came from and how they originated and what inspired what I was really starting to really love, which was a lot of ambient music and instrumental music and electronic music through my middle teens, late through teens, and into the early 20s. Um, this one I picked up without even knowing what it was, just based on the artwork, and that it was in the progressive bin, or it just looked interesting. It looked old, and then there's probably something on here that sort of, yeah. It says a composition in four movements for electronic music synthesizer. So as soon as I saw that, I take a chance on it. And this is, if you guys know Silver Apples, this is kind of in that range of, you go back to 1968 and they're still kind of, just getting to the point where the synthesizer's just been out for a couple of years now, and they're starting to get more dependable. You still can't really fully harness their sound as far as being able to play it like an instrument for the most part. They haven't come out with like keyboards yet, like digital keyboards yet. This is still back in the modular synthesizer lands, time. So when you go back to the late 60s until you get into like Wendy Carlos and Switched on Box, for example, you're going to have some producers that are sort of more on the experimental side, where they're sort of making sound collages and just kind of recording some of the interesting sounds that are making. Just remember, back in these days, these are sounds that nobody's ever heard before. That always just blew my mind. You think of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of wind instruments, right? And string instruments, right? Through the history of time, drums. Like, all these instruments have been made and been going on for hundreds, if not a couple thousand years old, right? Ever since probably, it's hard to say, 3, 4, 5,000 years old. Some of these instruments have been going on, right? Guitars, string instruments of some sort, drums of some sort, uh, wind instruments of some sort, right? But fast forward to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and now you have, or even the 20s with like theremins and stuff like that, just electronic. Now you have electricity. Now you have a new form of power, and you try to create something that it can do with music, right? So you have therems and other kind of experimental instruments, and then even some first keyboards that had, organs and things like that. And you fast forward to here, but some of these sounds have never been heard before. So you're just kind of wowed by the sounds that it's making, right? So that's a lot of this here, you know, but there is some organization to it. There is some not only just experimentalism in this album, but there is some song making. I'd have to say. Rudin's reputation was really established in in the '60s, throughout the '60s, because of his association with Robert Moog and his pioneering series of synthesized compositions. Um, he also taught at Juilliard, from 1981 to 1984. You know, um, he was part of the faculty at the Philadelphia Musical Academy here in Pennsylvania, which is which I live now, University of Penn. Um, so unfortunately, he doesn't have a lot of albums. He's been involved in a lot of certain things, but mostly in the schooling aspect of it. There's been a few compositions, and he's been on modern dance and film and television and some stage stuff like that. He's been involved with that, music for nature, collaborations, ballet, things like that, but not a lot of like recorded albums. I didn't see that a lot in his discography. This is the only album I know or have of his. It's kind of a shame that he didn't do more, but I'm sure there's probably some stuff he recorded um, that have been released after, because I have seen a couple of compilations pop up in the last 5-10 years of stuff that aren't on this album. So there must be some unreleased stuff and some things he decided to sort of let somebody else put out. But I wouldn't say this album is necessarily. This album is a step above weird. It's not just weird sounds. It is a little bit more scientific and random and playing with different sounds, but it's not like wildly like, just like here's an oscillator. You know what I mean? It's not like it's a little bit more focused. So in that respect, it's a step above like just being, experimental album. The first track is called Choros. It's exactly 10-minute tracks. The interesting thing is that, and I don't know why this is, but the tracks are even numbered tracks. One's 10 minutes, one's 7 minutes, 30 seconds, one's 5 minutes, one's 15 minutes. Like they're exactly either to the half minute or to the minute. I'm not sure if that was intentional or what the reason behind that is, but that's interesting. But yeah, track number one, there's 4 tracks on here. The first one is definitely kind of scientific sounding, with the oscillators kind of going wild a little bit, but some squiggles and sort of some lower end, like, almost sounds like electronic, like farts or squiggles or just strange noises, right? They're just like, and it's just kind of like, you're like, okay, this is probably going to be a little bit too weird for me. And after that, it kind of only does it for a couple minutes, and then it's sort of like, okay, well, it's gonna move off that, which is good. So you actually feel like there's gonna be some material in here. It's not just gonna be experimental to be experimental and just show what a keyboard can do. There's some method to the madness. I will say that. It finally settles on this track. Finally settles on some light, kind of ominous twinkling zone, kind of Twilight Zone melody for like 90 seconds, while the drum sort of sounds in the background, which almost sounds like a knock, but it's kind of like a electronic knock because it's on like a. It sounds like it's on like a metal hollow sound. It's abstract, but it's good. The first track, I gave it 3 stars. Second track is called Hybris. I also gave it 3 stars. This one's a bit more eerie and slightly demented. Some strange sounds kind of come and go, but it's even more focused than the first song, and so I give that one 3 stars as well. The third song is my least favorite. It's not really memorable, really, in any way. I gave it 2 stars. It was good, but it wasn't like. I think the direction is kind of lost on it. It kind of feels like an in-between track. And it could be because the last track is the longest and it's 15 minutes. And it's called Ete, I believe. A-T-E, but there's a on the E. This one's the most minimal and abstract, stark. Probably the most ambient thing on here. In fact, there's like a minute or two of just doesn't sound like anything's really going on. It's just you kind of hear like a very slow hum. It's kind of lightly coming into the foreground for like a minute or two. Like you almost think that that it's not even playing. Cool, some cool space effects on this track. I feel like the album evolves really well. Um, and so this track I give 3.25 stars. It's my favorite track, but it's a nice evolution of sort of this is what these instruments can do. Okay, let me kind of put it into use, play with the moods a little bit, and then kind of settle on probably the most minimal thing that he could have done instead of kind of like going the opposite and sort of doing a switched on Bach and try to create some sort of electronic song of cover song of something. Like this is kind of like a like an experimental soundtrack in a way. Um, to like some kind of science lab or something like that. That's what it sounds like. But overall, um, excuse me, 11.25 stars divided by 4 is a 2.81. So I feel pretty strong about giving it a 68 out of 100, right at the top of good. Can't really say it's a very good album. It's an interesting piece, and it's got some good sounds on it. But there's really nothing that really kind of it's kind of like barely verging on songs. But it's not, again, it's not just sound effects. It's kind of like maybe a little bit of sound noodling, a little bit of sound sculpting, trying a few different things, but nothing's like starting on songs or consistent or repetitive or really there's probably only two things that I could remember in the songs that were even sort of repeated like they were going to be a song, and that was sort of the twinkling sound at the end of the first track, and I think something in Hybris was sort of fairly consistent. The eerie part, slightly demented part, that one sort of sounded like it was from like a movie or something like that. But very abstract, but not to the point where it's not enjoyable. It's not like super experimental to where it's really you don't see any direction on it. And it's also great because it's not experimental in sound as far as like it just being like annoying sounds or uncomfortable sounds. Like there's a little bit of that, maybe like 30 seconds, a minute of that in the first track, but really for the most part there's still enjoyable sounds and there is a kind of a peacefulness in some of this sound, especially the last track because it's probably the most sparse one. So you do get some enjoyment in here as far as like listening to something experimental that has some good space on it that isn't just being experimental to be experimental. It's like it's got some rhyme to the reason, or some reason to the rhyme, but method to the madness. But it's enjoyable at least, and I think for that reason I can say it's a good album because sometimes the experimental albums, for me, they can get a little bit too dry and a little bit too, just I don't know. They don't really do a lot for me, and it's mostly because a lot of times they're not very easy on the ears because they're experimental in sound, but they're also not really memorable because they're not creative in song, and so this one doesn't really go overboard on either of those, and it really actually doesn't really even try too much to go on either of those, which it sort of gives it a nice space and a little bit more of a minimal abstract feel and almost sounds like early ambient music because there is a lot of space. I mean, there's times where like a minute goes by with nothing going on, and so there's a lot of feeling like you're like it could be good background music to like paint to or watch nature to or something like that. Like it kind of has like a training, like teaching you how to listen or teaching you how to just makes you kind of like go into thought a little bit too, and probably all relates to his interest in going into music theory and composition and directing and heading, the electronic music studio that he ended up heading as well. So just kind of all the early, um, signs of what he wanted to do and sort of recorded into an album. So I appreciate that. So it's an interesting album to listen to, but it's not going to be something that's going to be gone to a lot. But it's a good example of an early electronic synthesizer album. It's sort of there's not too many to check out in 1968, so there's not a lot to judge between. But this one's, I think it's pretty good, So yeah, that's my thoughts on this album. If you ever heard it, curious to know your thoughts. All right, thanks so much.